Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, I'm changing tack from nutrition to training. I got to chat with Brian Miner on the topic of progressive overload. Brian is currently a coach for 3DMJ and is also an educator, a certified strength and conditioning specialist, and an athlete with a master's degree in health and exercise science. The aim of this conversation was to demystify the concept of progressive overload. We discussed what progressive overload is, what tools you can use to track whether it's happening in your own training, how to choose a program when you're just starting out, and how to change that program as you become more and more advanced, and so much more than what I could possibly say in 30 seconds or in the episode description for that matter. So without further ado, let's get straight into this conversation. Hey Brian, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Today, I want to pick your brain a little bit on the topic of progressive overload. But to start with, who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at it?
Appreciate it. So I am a coach with 3D Muscle Journey. I was recently joined their team in July of this year. So, I've been coaching for, a decade prior to that. So it's been a good fit. I've known those guys and gals for a while, so it's been it's been a cool transition, and it's been good to kind of work within a team environment. So so I'm a coach, athlete. It's been a while since I've competed, but I compete in natural bodybuilding, raw powerlifting, and hopefully transitioning kind of back into the competitive space here in the next year or two. So
Oh, that's really interesting. And what kind of competitions are you looking at? What kind of sports?
Natural bodybuilding primarily.
Oh, awesome.
So I'd like to do a powerlifting meet next year in 2023, and then probably 2024 do a prep. So that's for a bodybuilding show. So that's the tentative goal. But what I've learned is, things as I continue to get older, things tend to you have to call some audibles every now and then, but hopefully I feel optimistic about this. So hopefully that stays the case.
Well, I wish you the best with your competitive endeavors. And also congratulations on joining 3DMJ. I've been following them and you for several years now. So when you joined them, it was almost like writing a fan fiction between two different fandoms. So a crossover fan fiction for me. I got a bit starstruck. I was like, "Ooh, that's cool." It was like when the Avengers came out in 2012, and I was like, "Ooh, so many superheroes in one movie."
I appreciate that. No, it's awesome. It's been really cool so far.
That's awesome, and it's because of your passion for strength sports and your knowledge about them and about training and muscle hypertrophy that I was so keen to have you on today, and specifically to talk about progressive overload, because in a variety of ways I've been consuming your content about it for many years, and I think you have some really interesting views about it that I haven't really seen elsewhere on the internet. I actually think that progressive overload is quite misunderstood by the average person going to the gym. So what I'm hoping to do with this podcast is to clarify it, demystify it, and give some practical applications for the listeners. So I want to start with a definition though. So when we're talking about progressive overload, what are we referring to?
Yeah, so it's one of the key training principles. Every program that we follow, needs to have some. We should be seeing some progressive overload in order to continue to progress. So the I think that what I like to kind of break it down as, and these are sort of definitions that I think explain things well, but this is you may get a different opinion from someone else, but I like to kind of break it down as overload and then progressive overload.
Hmm.
So what I consider overload is any training stimulus that's adequate to elicit a positive adaptation. So anything if you want to look at it on a session to session basis, that's like the minimum effective dose of stimulus or above that, which will lead to downstream adaptations. And then progressive overload, I think is best conceptualized is our ability to do more, more reps, more load, more distance, whatever we're training for, is a result of the adaptations. So, if we look at it from a broad perspective, it's like as we are able to do better, as we're able to perform better, we want to be pushing to perform better to sort of stay in that adaptive range. So, as we get stronger, that range for adaptation kind of shifts up the ladder a little bit, and we want to keep pace with that. And you can look at it from like a physiological level of, muscle fibers and, keeping, tension on high threshold motor units and things like that. But I don't think that's necessary for most people to get that deep into it. I think it's just that, we think of it as, we are improving our performance based off of, our ability to do so. So when we have, when we train, if we elicit, an adequate stimulus, then positive adaptations are going to come from that. And then when we come in to train again, we're able to do more that's now able to create a new overload stimulus. But I think where people who kind of get it wrong is that they have they kind of look at overload and progressive overload as kind of this spot on a map where they're trying to go in and achieve a stimulus that exceeds what they had just done. And I think it's kind of ironic because we see, I think a lot of people realize when it comes to training volume that there's a spectrum of volumes that we can train at that are going to elicit a positive adaptation. There's a range between like the minimum effective dose or stimulus, and then up to a maximum amount that we can benefit from. And usually it's kind of like an inverted U shape, where there's a sweet spot where we're balancing the stimulus with our recovery, and we're able to get the best net adaptation there. Well, the same thing can be true for the stimulus. Like it's not just volume. You can sort of substitute the term stimulus in right there in place of volume, and there's kind of that inverted U relationship there too. And so what creates an overload stimulus, from one session to the next isn't predicated on what we had just done. It's a kind of this large range that just kind of slowly, inches forward a little bit. And so trying to, beat the logbook every single session, especially as you get more advanced in training age, it's an unrealistic goal. And I think is you're trying to force adaptation, which isn't really how it works. It's like as adaptation accommodates it, you're able to do those additional reps, and they're important to do as you're able to do those additional reps because it allows us to continue to stay within that stimulus threshold, so to speak.
Thanks for that explanation. I find this view really interesting in how it contrasts with the popular view, where, at least the way I understand it, people seem to think that they are progressively overloading in the current session for the next for to benefit the next session. Whereas it seems like what you're explaining is that progressive overload in the current session has already occurred as a result of a number of previous sessions.
Hmm.
So it's almost like you're looking backwards, whereas most people are thinking, I need to produce progressive overload now for the future.
Yeah, that's true. I think, ultimately it is both. Like it's you're able to do more because what you were doing was sufficient.
Hmm.
But in order to keep allowing that process to continue, you have to kind of keep pace with your adaptations. And maybe that's the best way to explain it is you adapt, you want to keep pace with that minimum threshold for, an adequate overload stimulus. And so as adaptations accommodate, the stimulus is going to, in an absolute sense, is going to have to go up a little bit. So it is both. I think where the main message I want to get across and have tried to get across to people is
Hmm.
it's not it's it's both looking forward, but it's also because of what you were doing. So if you're it's not on a session to session basis. I mean,
Hmm.
adaptations, you can have adequate adaptations, positive adaptations that are being masked by, acute fatigue. And so there's a lot of things, like once you back up and look at it through, lens over a longer period of time, yes, you should see performance going up in you should be observing progressive overload, um, as a result of, productive training.
I see what you're saying. It makes sense in that if one session doesn't go well, that's not a reason to throw the program in the bin and move on to another program, which is what I think happens as a result of the popular view of progressive overload, where people can't add one more rep or more weight for a couple of weeks. And they think, oh, this program doesn't apply progressive overload anymore. I must switch to another one because this isn't working anymore. And so that's what
Yeah,
you're trying to convey, that it's not, that's not quite the case. Okay, that
exactly.
makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. So now
Mhm.
the positive adaptation that my clients and my audience, I personally primarily are focused on here are related to hypertrophy, so muscle growth. So in order to create progressive overload for hypertrophy, which training variables can we use? Most people, when they think of progressive overload, they're going to think of load on the bar or the number of reps. Um, are those two variables we can use? Are there others like volume, frequency, intensity of effort? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, when it comes to let's look at it from just the term overload. Like
Hmm.
in order to create an adequate stimulus, there's a lot of training variables that you can manipulate in order to do that. I mean, additional reps, additional load, additional volume. I mean, all of that is going to contribute, assuming effort is sufficient. But when it comes to like progressive overload, I try to think of it as, this is something that, all things equal is showing a net improvement in performance. So for example, like the idea like doing more volume is a form of progressive overload. I mean, that can be true, but if we're sort of operating within this model that I'm discussing, it's like doing additional volume isn't necessarily dependent on prior adaptations. It could just be dependent on having more time within that day. So it's things like added volume, like they help move the needle up in terms of like where the stimulus is at and how you know effective that stimulus is. If you're doing one set, per session per body part, you're going to struggle to kind of cross that conceptual overload threshold, which is, I say conceptual, but it's really, if we look at it from like a physiological perspective, it's the amount of work that's going to tip the scales in favor of protein synthesis over breakdown. It's like
Yeah.
this is the net, this is the amount of stimulus that's going to cause net muscle growth, assuming it's supported with adequate nutrition. Um, so added volume helps kind of move that needle. But when it comes to progressive overload and like, okay, these adaptations are accommodating, this increase in performance, I think the most common things to look at are going to be reps, load under similar conditions. And it doesn't have to be like, you can be seeing progressive overload that's not under similar conditions, but it's, for example, I guess a good example here would be, let's say you're doing 100 pounds and you do 10 reps and it's at 2 reps in reserve in week 1. And then in week 2, you do 100 pounds for 11 reps, but it's 1 rep in reserve. Like that is, you're probably still providing, an adequate stimulus. It's just like progressive overload. If we're using this kind of model, it could be that there's adaptations occurring. It just hasn't been adequate enough for us to, match performances there. Because in that example, you're able to do additional rep, or you're doing an additional rep, but you're also 1 rep closer to failure. So
Yeah.
the net performance is similar, but it could be, you're still performing well, or you're still, your training is still effective. It's just those adaptations take time. And I think we like to look at sets and look at performance in these, the confines of specific reps, within the confines of a set. And if we don't do an additional rep, we consider, okay, I haven't gone anywhere. But like I said, when you think of it as, this is the byproduct of, previous adaptations, it's possible maybe you weren't able to do an additional rep, but maybe that last rep moved, with a little bit more velocity, or maybe your technique has improved. And so it's like these additional reps and load, I mean, they're good proxies for, the progressive overload is occurring. But I guess when we think of assessing if something's working, you want to be able to compare apples to apples.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing, varying levels of reps in reserve, it can be harder to assess that. And it's not to say that you can't do that. You certainly can, and there's situations where I suggest it, but you want to be able to assess, like, okay, is my performance better today than it was the day before, if we sort of try to equate effort. And that's kind of, if it is, that means progressive overload is occurring over time. So hopefully that makes sense. That I probably wasn't the best way to explain it, but yeah, it's, sets and reps, like doing more reps, doing more load, those are, under similar conditions. That's a good sign that, your training has been overloading in nature and you're observing progressive overload. Doing additional volume, just, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're adapting. It could just mean that you're trying harder, or you have more time within that session. So I like to look at, if assessing if a program is working, looking at it more is like, okay, is performance, once you equate for effort in similar circumstances, has performance improved? And
Mm-hmm.
that's, I think, the best way to conceptualize it there.
Okay. So to prove whether it was a good explanation or not, since you're quite hard on yourself, let's see if I can summarize that, and you tell me if I got it right or wrong.
Perfect.
So my understanding is that you're saying that you believe that in order to assess whether progressive overload is occurring and therefore the program is effective, it's having the result that we want, you want to compare performance over time under similar conditions. And ultimately, this will be either more reps or more load added to the exercise under, again, similar conditions. Whereas you're also saying you could manipulate other variables that are not reps or load. You could try to add more sets, or you could try to increase the frequency so that you do more sets across the week. So you increase volume or you increase frequency, but these are not the same as your net performance actually improving under similar conditions. It could just be that one day you have an extra half hour and you throw in 2 extra sets of bicep curls. And since the biceps recover relatively quickly, across the week, you're not going to feel extremely fatigued and your performance is not going to go massively down. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're achieving progressive overload from adding those 2 extra sets. Would that be an accurate summary?
Yeah, that's good. So I may have done a better job than I thought. So yeah, that's exactly right. I think when a lot of people are talking about, tools to progressively, overload their training, a lot of them are, what they're probably really discussing is like tools to keep the stimulus within an adaptive range and sort of keeping pace with adaptations, whether they realize that or not. And what, there's examples where doing additional volume could be, a sign of an effective training program, and that's like if you're trying to develop, work capacity, within a short period of time, and your quality of volume is going up, as you with these additional sets, it's like you're recovering, better. Your performance within each set might be a little bit better. So it really depends on the goal. With hypertrophy though, specifically, I think it's, reps and load are probably the biggest ones. And then, proximity to failure. It's like if you do the same load and same reps, but it's, a rep high, 1 RIR, 2 RIR higher than what it used to be, then I mean that's a good sign. That's a sign things are moving well.
So in summary, for when we're saying similar performance improving under similar conditions, that could be reps going up, load going up, same load, same reps, but slightly higher, lower RIR. I get confused because I use RPE instead of RIR.
Okay, well, so we could use RPE. We'll frame it like that because
lower.
That's
RPE.
what I'm used to using too. So.
Oh, cool. So similar reps, similar weight, but lower RPE, so a lower intensity of effort relative to failure. These are all signs that performance is improving. I personally also use, particularly with maybe slightly more newer, like slightly more beginner clients who are trying different exercises for the first time. When their performance improves, I also tend to think that technique improving is a sign that we're getting the adaptations that we want, because they are learning how to use the musculature more efficiently. So they are going to be able to make more efficient gains for their target muscle, because now they're not just using their entire body to move the weight like you were doing in the beginning.
Absolutely. Yeah, technique is if you're doing the same reps, same load, but technique has improved. I mean, a lot of times people will, they break technique, or, you might see technical breakdown is a compensatory, mechanism to, help continue the set. But yeah, if they're able to maintain technique or improve technique, with an existing load, that's a good sign that positive things are happening.
Oh, that's great to hear.
And that the target musculature, is able to, the target musculature is producing more force probably in order to accommodate that.
Exactly. And it occurred to me, just for the listeners, when I say technique improvements, what I really mean is that the technique is more appropriate to target the muscle that you actually want to target, because there's no gold standard technique for any exercise. You can slightly manipulate technique to hit one body part slightly more than another. So if you're trying to train, for example, if you're using the squat to train specifically your quads over your glutes, an improvement in technique would be the ability to bias the exercise more towards the quads and using the glutes less to move the loads.
Exactly.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad you agree with me, because you have a lot more experience than me, so I know I'm doing something right.
Well, you understand it for sure. So that's a sure your clients are well on their way with that.
Thank you. All right. So something interesting that you said was that you defined overload, not progressive overload, as the minimum effective dose. So this the minimum effective stimulus necessary to elicit a positive adaptation. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. So it's I mean anywhere there is technically a threshold. We don't know, where it is. Like the threshold is, like I said, the stimulus that's going to, assuming adequate nutritional intervention, the stimulus that's going to lead to positive protein accrual in the muscle. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the granular way to look at it. But yeah, it's the kind of the threshold of the minimum effective dose. Beyond that, I like to think of it as a stimulus that's overloading in nature.
So, in the context of hypertrophy, there are several school of thoughts that I've come across in how to, what criteria to use to basically uh, get an idea of whether you're hitting that stimulus threshold or not, usually within a session or even after a few sets of an exercise for certain body parts. For example, a school of thoughts that I believe Renaissance periodization has popularized is to use criteria like your pump, the degree of disruption in the muscle, and the degree of soreness afterwards. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what tools or what criteria you can use to assess whether you've met that minimum stimulus threshold, for example, within a session for a certain body part.
Yeah, I don't. To be honest, I don't think there's a definitive way on an acute basis. Like say you have no prior data on
Hmm.
yourself. Um, I don't think there's a way to definitively know. Like everything we have is simply proxies. And so the reason I kind of like the model that I described is because improvements in performance, if you're able to, do additional load at the, same proximity to failure, if you're a power lifter and your estimated 1 RM is trending up, then we know what we've been doing is beyond the stimulus threshold, so but if say we have zero data on an individual and you're just going in and like, okay, how much am I supposed to do, rather than focus on like the pump and soreness, which, really are not, when they've been looked at in the literature, not really reliable proxies for this. I mean, they're um, I'm not going to say they're useless. I don't think that's the case. I mean, cell swelling, is going to, seems to play a role in hypertrophy. So, but you can, for example, if we look at it from a like mechanical tension perspective, which is, you know, pretty widely accepted as the primary driver of hypertrophy. Like you can be getting a high volume of, mechanical tension, of adequate mechanical tension with zero pump, so there's like you could be doing sets of four, maybe, or you could be doing 1 RMs and just doing a ton of sets and get an adequate growth stimulus. Not that we would recommend doing that, but just to illustrate the fact that the pump is not really, like, when we look at it from a tension perspective, not a reliable proxy, blanket proxy for, efficiency or, efficacy. Um, so to be honest, if I don't know anything about an individual, I simply put them, based on their training experience, their level of, development and training age. We have an educated starting point, based off of, okay, what volume were you doing? If we have that, if it's just a raw beginner, just someone who's never trained before, like, start them, you know, 2 3 sets, for an exercise, maybe 10 sets per week, or something on the low end, 5 to 10 sets per week. And you'll see they're still going to get stronger, so that's going to be Um, at least when we look at it from the perspective of like neurological adaptations, you could have them doing one set a week, and probably improve because it's beyond what they've been doing. So, in that sense, like performance isn't the perfect proxy for hypertrophy either, because there's neurological elements to it too. So like one set a week, yeah, you might, if you've never trained before, experience some hypertrophy from that, but you're going to probably see more like neurological benefits, that are coming from the lower volumes and I guess the performance improvements that stem from those. Um, so there's really no perfect measure for it. It's not like we're going to measure, um, like protein balance directly within a set. Like we can't do that. So,
I wish.
yeah. So it's not, and even then, like it's all largely dependent on you know adequate nutritional environment. So, um, like if you increase protein synthesis, but then you never eat you know if you don't have the building blocks to actually capitalize on it, then that's not really going to be a huge benefit. So, um in terms of net muscle growth. So, I think, yeah, I think that's kind of the big thing, is understanding there's not any perfect proxy for this. And just to start like with an educated starting point and realize like it's going to take some time to collect some data, but over time, like there's people that are experiencing muscle growth, and they're looking for proxies when the evidence is right in front of them, so it's like if you're noticing improvements in your physique, on a month to month basis, obviously that is like the ideal, like that is your net outcome that you're seeing improving. Now as you get more advanced, that's less and less prevalent. I mean, seeing those changes, like it could just be you've had more carbs, and just some increased fullness. So you really, the more advanced you get, the more you kind of want to look at, I think performance is the most predictive variable, and I mean performance like over time, across multiple rep ranges. Increases in a 1 RM, I mean, they're going to be much less reliable than increases, across multiple sets. So it's going to be, performance with, moderate, at least moderate volumes in most cases.
That makes sense. So it sounds like acutely, so in the short term, you don't really think there are reliable ways to assess whether we're getting that stimulus that we want. It's more a case of we need to be patient and look at performance over time. And that, in your opinion, is the most reliable criterion that we have presently.
I would say so, and it's not to say the pump is like, if you're getting a good pump, I mean, chances are you've probably done a reasonable amount of volume.
Hmm.
But and so in that case, it's like, okay, if you've done a reasonable amount of volume, like that probably is a sign that you're in a decent spot. But there's nothing that's going to definitively like put the stamp of approval, like, okay, this session has been overloading in nature because you get a pump. Like I could get a pump from doing one set of just really high reps on an exercise, or just do a ton of push-ups for one set. It's probably not going to be like a robust growth stimulus just doing one set. So it's all, I mean, there's, the proxies are kind of relative to what you're training, how it's structured. Like if you're doing sets of 8 to 12, and a pump might be a more reliable, um proxy for performing adequate volume. But there's really no reason to believe that the pump is correlated with the outcome that we're trying to reach, and that's like net protein balance. It's, these are all just rough estimates that are tend to be correlated rather than causative. And I think that's true for all of the things that we use, including performance. Improvements in performance correlate with increased hypertrophy, but they're not necessarily causative, because there's a lot more variables besides hypertrophy that adaptations besides hypertrophy that lead to improvements in performance as well. So um, my best advice is start with an educated guess on amount of volume, and then try not to overthink it and just train hard. And over time, it'll become very evident, and you'll be able to naturally refine it. I think too many people are like focused on these checkpoints within their session that they're looking for, and it's not always like we don't have a lot of data to support that that's the case.
That makes a lot of sense. I also think that, well, I tend to think that your position makes sense because I've noticed training people of different sexes that there are quite large differences in how they experience these criteria, like the pump or soreness.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, my clients who are assigned female at birth, identify as cisgender women, they have estrogen as their dominant hormone. They are workhorses. They can
Mm-hmm.
do loads of sets. They never get sore, but they also don't get a pump as easily. And so they worry, oh, I'm not getting a pump. Does that mean I'm doing something wrong? But their performance keeps going up. So then I need to to comfort them and tell them, look, the pump is not the only metric we're looking at. If you tell me you have one, that's, as you said, it's probably a good sign that something is happening. But if you're doing all of these sets, you're recovering really well, and your performance keeps going up, we don't need to worry that you don't get a pump. Whereas I might have a cisgender man with testosterone being his dominant hormone, and he can't do as many sets, but he gets this incredible pump, and again, his performance is also improving. Then again, I don't care that much about the pump. I care more that the performance is improving.
Exactly. Like a lot of these metrics, to reiterate, like performance is still, it's a proxy. It's correlative, but like out of all of them, like out of all of the things that, whether it be pump, soreness, performance, we think of like, okay, what is additional muscle growth providing us? And that's an increase in contractile capacity. It's like we're increasing the amount of cross bridging that's, available. And so with that said, it's like, okay, performance, if that's improving, that could be indicative of, okay, we're performing better because we have this increased capacity for force production, through an adequate stimulus that we've been imposing. And that could be a result of hypertrophy, or at least partially mediated by hypertrophy. Whereas like a pump and soreness, like they're like that alone, you look at it from like, okay, why would those be indicative of adequate, that overload has occurred, and so part of this is me being biased just based on how I conceptualize this model, is like looking back, okay, is what I've been doing been providing an adequate stimulus? Like the pump and soreness don't really provide insight into that. Like performance does, especially if you look at it through a wide lens.
I appreciate you
I agree.
clarifying.
Like, yeah. So, but I agree with you. Depending on sex, it's going to, there's drastic differences in soreness, volume tolerance, ability to get a pump, things like that. So, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Like it's especially once you start looking across, different individuals, the story becomes even more misleading there if you're looking at those as metrics, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm glad you clarified your own biases and the fact that this ultimately is your way of conceptualizing this, because I think what's important and what I think some people might miss is that we don't have definitive answers on how to achieve hypertrophy reliably at this point. We have a lot of different models, and there might be some truth to each one of them. but we don't know for sure this is what you must do in order to achieve hypertrophy. And I think it's important for the listeners to get this out of the podcast among all of the other takeaways, just so that they don't get locked into a limiting way of thinking where only a certain training program is going to help, when there are, especially for hypertrophy. I think hypertrophy is quite a forgiving goal to have, because you can achieve hypertrophy in literally so many ways, excluding sitting on a couch.
Yeah. And I guess one thing, to mention, this isn't, I don't want to like take ownership of this idea. Like this isn't my, like a concept that I came up with, a model that I came up with. What, and I think a way to kind of illustrate this is, like, if anyone's really looked at, how studies are structured, like a lot of people will say, okay, how do they progressively overload training in research? Um, and sometimes they don't make mention of it in the papers themselves, and that's because a lot of times it's built into the protocol. So, for example, um, they may have somebody doing 3 sets at an 8 to 12 RM. So in research, things are often usually standardized for effort by training to, a point of failure, whatever, um, definition of failure that they're after, is. But um, usually they try to standardize effort by training to failure. Um, and so that takes care of that. But usually what they do is they just increase load if the individual falls outside that rep range. So
Mm-hmm.
if they're doing sets of 8 to 12 RM and they're not able to complete a load, they'll, or a set within that range, they'll reduce the load. And if they're able to complete sets within that range, um, or at the top end of the range, if they exceed the top end of the range, they'll increase the load. And so it's a reactionary you know manipulation of loading based off of their performance, which is exactly kind of what we're talking about here. It's your ability to perform better is because what you've been doing has been effective. Um it's more just like I just observed that, and um, tried to kind of convey that. But yeah, I don't want to. It's not my model by any means, but it's something I'm happy to try to make a little bit more mainstream, and click for people, because it takes a lot of pressure off people too. I think sometimes people go in and they think, okay, I have to do an additional rep, in order to keep the progress coming, and that's not usually the case. It could be, if you have a bad day, you could go. We talked about that conceptual inverted U curve. It's like, let's say on the best day, you're right at the peak of that curve in terms of stimulus. Like, you're getting the most you can out of that session. On a bad day, say your performance isn't as good, that doesn't mean you're not going to make any progress. It could just mean you've now shifted more towards the more minimum effective dose of things. So performance, like, we don't want to, like, it really is performance over time, especially as you become more advanced. You're not going to be doing additional reps, additional load every session, and if you are, and you're kind of trying to force it along, that's not really how our physiology works. It's not like our body knows what rep we're on, and it doesn't know, like, okay, as soon as he gets this additional rep, we're gonna build some muscle. Like, obviously that's not the case. So um so yeah, I think a lot of people will try to force it when that's really not how it works, and in the process, like, technique can start to suffer. You can put yourself in precarious positions. um yeah, if you're like contorting your body within a machine in order to try to get out an additional rep and you get it and you're like, feel this sense of satisfaction, like, okay, I moved the logbook. It's like, okay, you really didn't do anything, but you except just try as hard as you could to cheat out an additional rep. That additional rep was not indicative of positive adaptations. Like, that was indicative of you being insistent on logging that additional rep in your logbook. So I think that's kind of the, you know, I've gotten some pushback on this before. It's like, okay, well, it's a chicken or the egg scenario. Like, this is kind of minutia, and in some degrees, I think it is. But when you look at how a lot of people are training, it can, I think, pretty radically change the way they view their progression format and how they approach their training on a day-to-day basis. And I think that can have huge benefits both in terms of longevity, mental outlook. You don't feel like a failure if you don't complete your what you would hope to do. It's respecting the fact that your body's state of performance, its ability to perform, there's a lot of volatility there on a day-to-day basis. And as you get older and the training age advances, like, it's unrealistic. Like, adaptations don't come at a rate that's going to accommodate additional reps, additional load every single session, and so it's unreasonable to expect that.
Oh, absolutely. I think that if there is no other advantage to understanding this and embracing this idea, there is the advantage that it prevents people from giving up, because so many people
Mm-hmm.
give up on training altogether when they think that it's just not working for them. How many people
Mm-hmm.
past the beginner stage, they stop getting newbie gains and they think, oh, I'm not growing like a weed anymore, I guess this bodybuilding thing isn't for me. And
Mm-hmm.
they don't continue training. And ultimately, what we're saying here, the underlying message, I believe, is that consistency over time is what's going to get you the best results. Because if you're not consistent, your performance ain't going anywhere. And
Yeah.
and so again, embracing again this idea has the benefit, in my opinion, that it keeps people consistent.
Absolutely. I agree with that completely. It's yeah, it can be pretty discouraging if you get past the newbie stage and you're used to, slapping 2.5, 5 kilos on the bar every single time you go into the gym. And then all of a sudden you hit a wall. It's natural to think like, okay, something's wrong here. Like, what do I need to change? And oftentimes you're doing fine. You just need to change the rate at which you're expecting. Like, you don't need to manage your program necessarily, to a large degree. It's just managing your expectations, which I guess indirectly would manage your progression format to some degree. But in terms of like overall volume, you may not need more. And it's, I think people, the volume conversation is interesting because it's certainly correlated. Higher volumes are going to be, there's a dose response relationship there. It's not linear. But more volumes up to a point are going to be more beneficial. But over time, like, as you're getting stronger, that additional load is going to keep each set stimulative. It's going to continue to place mechanical tension where you want it to be placed. And so I really don't see, like, in practice, like, volumes having to come up a substantial amount, to be honest with you, across a training career. um, I think sometimes people will increase volume and see a little bit better progress, but like your minimum effective dose, like that threshold, I do feel isn't moving up at the rate that most people realize and on the time scale that people think. Like, it's certainly not, week to week. Which, if if it increased each week, then the idea of like, okay, we need to add load, add an additional rep, that may be necessary to continue to create like an overload stimulus, because the minimum, the floor is rising at such a rapid pace. But I mean, like, we just had a podcast with 3DMJ where we were talking about, a few of us, as we've gotten older, training volumes have kind of come down, and we're kind of getting more out of each set, and we're kind of settling into the idea that we don't need to push volume as assertively to still make progress. And I think that's true. I think is like I said, as you get stronger, as you're able to do more reps, like each set is still going to be providing a similar magnitude of stimulus. And over time, yeah, you might have to do a little bit more volume, but it's not like, okay, I started at 3 sets, now in order to create an overload stimulus I got to do 12 or something like that. As you're getting stronger, that's a lot of that's taking care of itself.
It's funny you mentioned that podcast episode, which, by the way, I did listen to, because I was just going to say that this is pure anecdotes. When I personally started, I got into bodybuilding and I read the Muscle and Strength Pyramids by Eric Helms, right?
Mhm.
And when I read that there's a relationship, a dose-response relationship between hypertrophy and volume. At this point, I was very, very green. So in my head, I was like, you know what? I want to build as much muscle as possible. I'm going to do as much volume as I possibly can fit into my
Yeah.
time in the gym. And
Yeah.
then what actually happened was that as I got more experience with training, as I was more consistent, I actually dropped that volume by half, if not even more. And it's because all of a sudden I just couldn't recover from that much work, because every
Yeah.
single set I could make better use of it. Like you're saying, I had just become more efficient at getting more out of the one set. So if before I was doing two
Yeah.
sets to achieve a stimulus, because some of those reps weren't the best, I wasn't really getting as close to failure as I might have needed to, and other reasons. Now, with one set, maybe I could achieve the same stimulus just because I become more efficient. So essentially, you're saying that you saw the same in your own experience.
Exactly.
That makes sense. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that nobody ever needs to increase volume. Maybe some people legitimately do. And for some, and also I think it depends on the body part we're talking about too. Because I've certainly
Mhm.
found that with some muscle groups, I have increased my volume compared to what I was doing previously for a variety of reasons. And with others, it's come down. So I don't want to imply that nobody ever needs to increase volume and volume does not matter for hypertrophy. But anecdotally, in my own personal experience, that's what I've seen as well. And I've also seen that if there is an increase in volume that's required, it doesn't become necessary as quickly as people seem to think, because I've kept so many clients on the same exact volume. I've kept myself on the same exact volume for months, if not years, before I thought, well, maybe we could try to increase it, and because
Yeah.
maybe it's not working as well. So I think what you're saying, what you've been saying up until now, which is that time is very important, is really key here, because I think people tend to jump to conclusions a little bit faster than the body actually makes adaptations, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%.
Cool. So, in fact, I think it would be valuable. We have been talking about train age, and it's not something that I've touched upon in my podcast, on my podcast before. So, I think if we could define train age a little bit more, and also what realistic expectations people should have or might want to have based on their current train age, I think that would be really valuable for the audience, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, training age is one of those things that I try to be careful discussing, because I think a lot of people will, um, they can kind of put limitations on their beliefs in terms of what they can expect. And I think that can be detrimental. Um, I mean, it's that fine line, right? It's like you don't want to have unrealistic expectations to the point where you're, discouraged, but you also don't want to have like this self-limiting mindset into what you can accomplish. So, um, which I do feel like some of those, like when people look at training age, sometimes that comes through with people. I'll get questions like, okay, I've been training for 3 years. I am I advanced or intermediate? And it's like my response is usually like, okay, well, ultimately it we want to stay reactionary with our training regardless, so it's where you fall on like this chart that we, is created by somebody that's, just based off of just anecdote and subjective, definitions is sort of irrelevant to some degree. But that said, I think that the main concept to come through with it is gains are going to come slower as you get more advanced, and the rate, because of that, the or I should say adaptations will occur slower, all things equal. And with that comes, a slower rate of progression, in terms of load and in reps. So, um, I think breaking it down is like, okay, a beginner, if you're making progress on a session to session basis, or, a week to week basis, that, if we're comparing apples to apples, like, okay, I did a, you know, set of 5 at a, you know, 2 RIR or 8 RPE, whatever, and, I'm doing that and my loading is going up every single week. That's going to be, um, yeah, if you're seeing kind of predictable progress like that, you're probably still in like the beginner phase, Um, and if it's more like every couple weeks or, block to block, um, you're probably more intermediate, but there's still like you can still make progress block to block on, you know, as an advanced athlete. It's just it may take you, like with advanced athletes, may take, a full block and a deload to really see actualize that progress, to really see it come down. And so, fatigue is going to start to mask things, I think, to a larger degree as you become more advanced. And so once you dissipate that fatigue, it doesn't mean that adaptations aren't occurring during that process, but sometimes you have to be patient and realize, okay, once I deload or once I taper, then we're really going to see what, you know, how productive this block was in terms of performance improvements. So yeah, it's like session to session or week to week. Maybe, you're probably still kind of in that beginnerish stage. If it's week to week or block to block, um, maybe intermediate, and then, advanced. It's usually, um, under similar conditions anyway, like a block to block type of thing. Um, but it also depends on the movement, like doing an additional rep. I guess here's another thing to kind of conceptualize is, the increase in stimulus. Like doing an additional repetition on a lateral raise, say a set of 15, going from 15 to 16 is require a significantly smaller degree of adaptation than doing 15 reps with 5 pounds additional load, for most people. So it really depends on how you're quantifying things too. Um, but because of all of this, like that's kind of one of the reasons I don't read too much into these, how people kind of categorize things. It's just looking at, okay, am I seeing improvements on a daily basis, or is it taking weeks or months, to really definitively know, like, okay, muscle is being put on. And that's the other thing, like with advanced athletes, if the goal is hypertrophy, I mean, performance is still just a proxy for that, like we said. So, you know, sometimes with a bodybuilder, it's going to take, for a really advanced athlete, you might look a little bit fuller in the off season. Occasionally it's obvious that muscle growth has occurred. But there's plenty of bodybuilders where it's like it takes that subsequent reduction in body fat to then realize, like, oh wow, you have put on a significant amount of muscle. And Alberto Nunez, is a good example of that with 3DMJ. In the off season, he had a very productive off season. But I don't know how much bigger he necessarily looked like in street clothes at the peak of his off season, but it's very evident now that he's cut back down and reduced body fat. So sometimes, like, the actual bottom line outcome, you don't really definitively know until, months or sometimes years down the road, which I think is hard for people to to accept. I think for, someone who's just getting into the sport, it's like, well, that doesn't sound motivating at all. I'm gonna have to continuously work harder for less and less, and that's why, like, just focus on the phase you're in. Um, be reactionary with it. Don't put too much stock in, like, okay, what training age am I? Just operate based off of your own data, and you'll in just enjoy the process of getting stronger and bigger. And it's going to yeah, if you fall in love with the process of it, the other stuff is gonna take care of itself.
That makes sense. Thanks for explaining. So my understanding is
Mhm,
that training age is defined by the rate at which adaptations occur, and the higher your training age, so the more the older a lifter you are, the slower the adaptations are going to occur. However, just like most things in fitness, actually, you're suggesting that it may be better to base what you think your training age might be off of your own individual data, and not try to put yourself into a box of beginner or intermediate or advanced, but
mhm,
rather when you're starting out, expect that at some point you see your adaptations occur more slowly, even if you're keeping under similar conditions. And then when
mhm,
that happens, rather than giving up or thinking that something is wrong, realize that perhaps your train age has now increased to a point where adaptations are slowing down.
mhm,
And it makes sense to me because, again, there is often I see the temptation to rely on cookie cutter programs or very standardized concepts that create categories for people, because I mean I think it's just human nature to want to have a simple heuristic to
mhm,
understand something and to decide what to do. Essentially, people want to know what they need to do to see the results that they
mhm,
want, when ultimately, in my experience as a coach, I've come to realize that everybody is a unique individual. So it's much better, as you said in the beginning, make an educated guess and then base any changes you might decide to make in the future off of previous data that you collected on yourself, rather than on some definition of training age and of what a beginner might see in terms of return on investment versus a more advanced lifter. Would that be an accurate Cliff Notes version of this part of the discussion?
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I think there's some value to, these templated programs, because of people's desire to just have, like, okay, just tell me what to do. Like, I don't like, a lot of people don't know how to manage their own data when they first start, and
Oh
it's
yeah.
so it's and that's okay, and that's normal. But I think templated programs, that are kind of put in categories like intermediate, 12-week intermediate, bodybuilding program, like, those are still helpful. Like, there's still, you can put yourself in that category. And if a program is allowing you to take action and actually start and be consistent, then that data is going to emerge from that. So I really have nothing against those. I mean, I think especially early on in someone's training career, you start to realize pretty quick, like, okay, this is, like, wow, I feel really run down by this amount of volume. Okay, maybe it's a little bit too much. Or, I'm not really progressing much with this program at all. I'm following it to a T. Maybe you do need a little bit more volume, but it's getting you started. And I think I see a lot of, newer, or, beginner or intermediate lifters, if, kind of using those terms here, that sort of become a little bit paralyzed by analysis. Like, okay, how, like, I don't want to do the wrong thing. Like, I need to have the perfect plan before I start and feel, that this is the right thing for me. And sometimes just being sold on the idea, like, okay, this is the program that's for you. Here's a templated program that's, going to work. Like, if it just creates that initial buy-in, like, I think that as long as the individual is able to stay healthy through the training, like that's at least getting them started. And I think that is actually a limiting step for a lot of people, is like, okay, they'll maybe write their own training, then 2 weeks in they'll change it, or they'll start a templated program 2 weeks in and then switch it. And so just committing to a program of some sort that's decently well thought out, is going to, like, a lot of that. And then you stay reactionary from there, and you just assess it. And like, I think the refinement process of, you know your beliefs towards training, the refinement process of technique, like, that's what I love about the training process. Like, if I got everything perfect out of the gate when I first started training, like, it would sort of lose some of its allure. Like, it's one of those things, like, yeah, maybe I'd probably have better, progress by now. I'm sure I would. But that ongoing refinement that people have, like, I've seen people that will, their adaptations, they may assume, like, okay, adaptations for this muscle group is, very slow, like, I'm kind of in an advanced training age, maybe. And then you look at their technique and it's like, okay, well, let's clean that up. And you clean that up, and all of a sudden, like, progress picks back up. And so it's like they had kind of put themselves in this box, but there's always something you can dial in on and improve over time. And that's the fun of it. Like, that's the fun. And it's going to, if you're able to move the needle, it once you've been training for, a decade plus, like, that's pretty satisfying, because it does take some strategy. And you can't just go in and red line effort every single day and expect to efficiently progress. Like, it does take some strategy. And especially on the natural side, like, it's kind of a, yeah, there's just a little bit more managing of the variables that I think needs to occur, in more advanced stages, to manage fatigue, than there is on, the enhanced side.
Thank you for making that point, actually. I'm glad you did. I didn't mean to imply that I'm against templated programs
Oh,
necessarily.
no, no. Yeah.
In fact, I just want to make it clear, I very much agree with you. I think anything that gets people to get started and be consistent for some time is of value, because I believe that consistency is the bottom of the pyramid, to steal something that Eric Helms might have created already. But anyway,
Yeah.
if you don't have consistency, nothing else matters, because you're not going to see adaptations if you're not doing the thing. And it's the same with calorie calculators. I think that personalizing your approach is at some point necessary. However, if a calorie calculator puts you in some sort of ballpark, even if it's not the most accurate, it gets you started, because otherwise you'd have no idea of how many calories to eat. That's fine by me, because, as you say, once you have just a bit of data, even just 2 weeks of training or of counting your calories, you're going to be able to make adjustments based on the results that you see or don't see. What I'm trying to promote is, rather than black or white thinking, where people get stuck thinking, I must adhere to this templated program now forever, or oh, I need to have everything personalized from the beginning and really nail the most personalized program to me, or else I won't grow. What I want to promote is the thought that get started in any way that actually gets you into the gym consistently, and then be open to the idea that things may need to change or may not. And if they do need to change, don't assume that that's because of something going wrong. That's basically the point I was trying to
Exactly.
make.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree with everything you said there. So it's good stuff.
Cool. We're on the same page there. And I also think we've covered a lot of ground during this conversation. It was really, really thought provoking for me, and hopefully for the listeners as well. Before we go, I want to know, do you think there's anything that we haven't really covered, or maybe we touched upon it but you'd want to expand on it, that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
Um, I mean, I think we covered a lot of it. I think the biggest thing is, the message that I tried to get across, when I first started kind of talking about progressive overload. Um, is just like try to like don't panic with your training. Like don't assume you have to get turn the music up, sniff ammonia in order to get additional rep, and like your progress is dependent on it. Like that's like I think it helps understanding, how muscle growth works, the factors that do impact performance, and just looking at raising obvious questions like, okay, why would it be the case that you know what your progress is dependent on beating what you previously did, as if your muscle has like a memory to it, so it's just doing enough to tip the scales in favor of muscle growth, in favor of positive protein balance, if we want to get that in the weeds. um, and there's a wide range there, just like there's a wide range for volume, there's a wide range for effective stimulus within a session. um, and I think a lot of the people that tend to have that mentality, like, okay, I need to beat the logbook every single session, is they're also accepting of the idea, like, that there's a spectrum of volumes that people can perform and make progress, which you would think would sort of make them realize that the same is true for performance within a session, but it's not always the case. Um so yeah, just find something that you enjoy, that you stay healthy with, and you know be consistent with it, and progress is going to come over time, especially if you're staying reactionary with it. And okay, is performance trending up over time? Is you know am I staying healthy? Are my joints feeling good? Like those are the big things for longevity, that's going to allow you to stick with it long enough to really build something that a lot of people may not realize is possible naturally when they first start out. It just takes a long period of time. And you talk to any you know advanced high level pro natural bodybuilder, and they're all going to probably say, like, okay, consistency is like, time is the biggest factor here. Like, they've probably all tried various styles of training during their training careers, and they kind of refine it based off of preferences, what they prefer, um, you know, to do in terms of movements, there. And so you start to create additional and reinforce biases as you get older. And I think you see that with people, putting recommendations out. And nobody's immune to that. So that's okay. But, as there's a lot, like, as you said, like, that the term, hypertrophy is a forgiving goal. That's very true. There's a lot of, power lifters that train, you know, do squats for 5 or less reps, 90% of the time. And a lot of them still have, the high level lifters may still have jacked legs, so it's not like something that may not look optimal on paper, like on a set to set basis, like, is still moving the needle over time. Um, so yeah, it's just, it's hard because I think there's value in having new information for sure. It's just we have to manage, like, our expectations, and realize that, like, research, like, the real world training experience, like, it's not in a vacuum. Not every variable is going to be controlled as tightly. You can look at the studies that look at up to like 30, the Schoenfeld study, where they had, I think, 30 plus sets, positive benefits up to that point. Well, put yourself in the context of like a full comprehensive program that's hitting, every muscle group the way, a bodybuilder may intend to do. And, a lot of that is going to change, like, the science is going to illustrate concepts for us. And the big takeaway there, in my opinion, is, like, up to a point, more volume is going to be beneficial. But, it's obvious that we can do too much. And like just buy into the long game, and the rest of it is going to take care of itself.
And to your point, I think in order to buy into the long game, it's really important to find a way to enjoy the process, because I believe that at least some people panic about beating the logbook, as you said, because they are so focused on the outcome. But we've been saying all along that the outcome is going to take so long that if that's all you focus on, if all you focus on is adding an inch to your biceps, you're going to give up, because it takes far longer than most people have patience for to see that kind of results. Whereas what's going to keep you training long enough to actually achieve that outcome is enjoyment of the process, not of the ultimate outcome of achieving muscle growth. So I think it's very important what you said there. Find something you enjoy and stay consistent. That is the key ultimately to see the results that we're trying to get with overload alone, with progressive overload, with all of these strategies to accomplish hypertrophy.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So in summary, start with an educated guess, be consistent, track your data, expect that things may change, and for the worse, ultimately, your rate of adaptations will slow down over time. Track your performance, and of all the tools that we discussed, potentially performance isn't perfect, but if your performance in terms of reps, load, or RPE, so intensity of effort, proximity to failure, is improving over a long period of time, and long is relative to your training age, then likely things are falling into place for you listeners to build a little bit of muscle. Now, Brian, thank you very much for being so generous with your time. Now I want to give you a few minutes to plug anything that you would like.
Well, I appreciate it. No, I enjoyed the conversation. I've talked about this topic, a good bit on other podcasts, but it's good, reaching new audiences. Like it's a message that I think deserves to be reinforced, when possible. So no, I appreciate you having me on. Plug things. So I 3DMJ, obviously, coaching. I'm a coach with them, and with the competitive season starting to come to a close for 2022. We're starting to, like, we encourage athletes that are interested in prepping in 2023 to, like, now would be the time to get on that. So yeah, if you're interested in working with 3DMJ, I would contact us. It's on our website, 3dmusclejourney.com/coaching, I believe. But yeah, other than that, I help out with the JPS mentorship program in Australia. I'm one of the lecturers for that. That's a great coaching mentorship program that they have in place. But yeah, those are kind of the two big the two big ones. But yeah, just if anyone has any questions, feel free to email me or message me, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Where can they message you? Are you on Instagram?
I am on Instagram at bdminer. I obviously the probably most efficient way to get a hold of me is email. But I do read DMs. So I try to get to them in a timely manner when when I can. But obviously, my own clients and everything are the priority. So, but yeah, if anybody has anything that they need, happy to help.
That's awesome. And just so the listeners know, I did the JPS mentorship back in 2020, so I can vouch for its quality. I learned a lot from all of the content that 3DMJ puts out, so definitely check them out, listeners. I will put all of the links and Brian's email address in the show notes for you. Thank you for listening today, and I'll chat to you next time. As always, thank you very much for lending me your ear for a while. I hope that you found this conversation valuable. As always, you'll find all links and resources to be able to connect with me or Brian in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.